Hi everyone, welcome back to Demand Decoded. Thanks for taking the time to join us today. I'm Dan Stilgo, marketing manager at Blend, and really pleased to be joined today by Jonathan Reid, co-founder at Reidentify, a B2B podcast agency. And what better topic to discuss today than B2B podcasting, of course. And in particular, we're going to discuss and look at how to create and grow a podcast in the B2B space. Great to have you here, Jonathan. I know when we met at the Demand Gen meetup in London, we had some really good conversation. I got some really great insights from you, and from that, it was kind of, I was itching to get you on. I thought, like, we really need to kind of share these expertise with more people. So, yeah, really great to have you here, and thanks for coming on and joining us today.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here, Dan. Thanks for the invite as well. And shout out to George and Sarah as well for hosting that demand meetup. That was amazing. I think they should keep doing it as well, right, Dan?
Keep doing it, and maybe another
Absolutely.
session on podcasting because I missed that
Yes.
one, which is disappointing.
Next time. Well, you're getting a session today, right?
True. This is my equivalent, right? It's
There you
just
go.
just for everybody else to enjoy as well. Awesome. Right. So as we do go along, as always, please do ask any questions that you might have for Jonathan about podcasting, whether it's starting out, whether it's growing, tactics to grow, things that we're talking about, metrics, all those things. We're going to cover them. But yeah, if you've got any questions or points, drop them in the comments section of this video on LinkedIn. And yeah, we can pull them up and, dig into Jonathan's podcast brain, basically. So
Let's go.
I guess the best place to start, and just to kind of frame this conversation, why should B2B companies be considering podcasting in the first place?
Well, number one, the main reason of podcasting, if you really think about it, is just to get your voice out there. That is literally what you're doing. You're getting your voice out there. And I like to call the industry, or a lot of industries and the market in general, the sea of sameness. Because when you look around, there's a lot of companies that look very similar, but you have to think what differentiates them. And one of the biggest things that could differentiate you these days is a podcast, especially with the rise of AI and everything like that as well. Like, what is actually going to differentiate yourself? Like, what is going to differentiate your company? And it can be a podcast. And I don't think the podcast is the solution. Like, many people might think that I think the podcast is the be all and end all. No, I don't think the podcast is the solution for every single company. But I think if it is beneficial to you and your plan and your strategy moving forwards, I say you should go for it. But as I said, it's not for everybody.
How do you identify, though, if it is a good fit for you or if it isn't?
Well, first of all, you have to understand that a podcast is something that takes time, it takes effort, and it takes resources to run. Right? Can be very beneficial. Hence why I do it, and I love doing it as well. And I always, love working with my clients around podcasts. But you have to think first of all, can we take that on right now? Like, can our marketing team handle it? Also, are things already working? Because if you're trying to do a podcast to make up for things that aren't already working in the business, in the company, then it can end up being quite frustrating because you're spending so much time, so much resource, so many resources, so much energy on making this thing work when you should be focusing your energy on making other things work in the company and adding the podcast as an add-on, right? When
Mm.
things are already working and making you go faster.
One way that we've really found it beneficial to us is actually to power that content creation engine.
Mm,
Being the central piece of all of the other content that you create afterwards. You're not necessarily looking for instant tangible results from the podcast, which are a bonus and do come, but powering the rest of your content strategy is one of those key benefits that we've seen.
absolutely. Absolutely. And I've seen it too. And I like to use what I like to call the hub and spoke model. Dan, I was happy when I created this one because I was like, this is genius. I even gave myself a pat on the back, right? I'm really hyping this up now. So essentially what the hub and spoke model is if you think about an old school wheel, right? You have the hub, which is the center of the wheel. Even modern day wheels that have the same thing. The hub, which is the center of the wheel, and I call that the podcast. And you have the spokes coming off of the hub, which is the social media, which is blogs, which is the newsletter, which is talks, which is events, for example. And then you have that circle around the spokes and the hub, and that's the whole strategy. That's the whole marketing strategy, for example. But then inside of that, you can have that podcast as that center, as that hub of your whole marketing strategy to give you all the content that you need to put out onto all of the platforms that you have.
Yeah. And just to clarify then, I'm not sure we went into it, as much as we should, but like who absolutely shouldn't be doing podcasting? Like who's just rule it out of their marketing mix, so to speak?
Companies that already have too much to do. Companies that already have too much to do. I see it so many times where hosts will get burnt out, teams will get burnt out just because they're trying to pile a podcast. It's similar to what I said earlier, because they're trying to pile a podcast onto everything else that they're doing. Because I know as marketers, we're already wearing way too many hats, right? We're wearing way too many hats, and it's not benefiting us adding something else on top of it, which already takes a lot of time and a lot of attention.
What about the kind of like measurement piece that goes into it? Because I feel like a lot of businesses are quick to turn off a podcast after they start it, in which case they shouldn't have started in the first place, right?
Yeah, I mean, because number one, they might have been in that position which I spoke about before. Things were already not working in the business, and they were trying to look for a way to make it work. And they thought a podcast was the right way to make things work. And a podcast is a longer term strategy, and a podcast, it will work. But the problem is, and where people go wrong a lot of the times, they don't do it for long enough, and it doesn't last because they think this is not working. No, it just hasn't worked yet. It hasn't worked yet. And when you have that mixture of not being ready to start a podcast and launching one anyway, and then also like other things are happening in the business which you need to take care of, it's not a good mix. It's not a good mix. And you said the measurement piece too. I think it's important that we track the right metrics. And what I mean by track the right metrics, you have to look at the right things to make sure that we're actually making the correct progress, or progress in the correct areas. So we spoke earlier about views and, listens and everything to podcasts and such. And I said to you that some people aren't happy with their views, some people are. It really depends on what your goals are. So let's say, for example, you want the right people to listen to your podcast. You don't need to get thousands and thousands of views per episode. If the right people are listening, then you can get hundreds of views. Like, for example, I said to you earlier, the podcast that I've launched about a couple of months ago, it doesn't get a crazy amount of views, but the right people are listening to it. Hence why we're generating revenue off the back of the podcast. And we're measuring things like inbound leads, right? We're measuring things like so it's not necessarily just views and followers and subscribers that we're measuring inbound leads. We're measuring actual qualitative things as well. So like how much feedback are we getting, how many messages from our ICPs are we getting? We're measuring things like that because in our opinion that's more important than the views, right? And we're also measuring what type of content does well and even triggers these things, like even more leads, and even more interested people, even more interaction from our ICPs. We try that kind of thing.
Yeah, nice. And I feel like outlining those measurements, the metrics that you want to track, what you want to improve, where you're looking to see the lift and things from the podcast, like are important to set out from the beginning, like in order to make sure you're measuring the right things and not setting unrealistic expectations from the
Yes,
podcast and giving it the time to work before you actually create it.
absolutely. And I think people should at least give a podcast 6 months. At
Okay.
least give a podcast 6 months. That's what I think. And it doesn't have to be, you don't have to have all the bells and whistles. I like to call it an MVP, a minimum viable podcast. I gave myself a pat on the back for that one as well when I came up with that. I call it a minimum viable podcast. And essentially all that is what the way I like to look at it, 2 podcasts per month that you can upload on a regular basis. It doesn't have to be anything pretty. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. It's just getting something out there so you can test this idea of a podcast. Right. And a podcast is a long-term strategy. And I'll say it once and I'll say it again. It is a long-term strategy. So we have to understand that we have to go at it for at least what was that stat that I put up the other day? I think 70% of podcasts don't make it past episode 3 and 90% of podcasts don't make it past episode 20. So what are we going to do to make sure that we get past that, at least that initial stage, right? And then that's why I say at least give it 6 months. At least give it 6 months. So you can at least outlast other people and see what is working and what isn't working.
Well, there you go then. So Demand Decoded is technically in the top 10% of podcasts because this is episode 40. So
Wow, well done.
congrats to us, right? Let's keep it going. So I actually wanted to unpack that getting started piece a little bit, if that's okay. Like I'm interested in hearing your advice about how people can get started. What kind of equipment and software is actually essential for starting a B2B podcast and the different scales within that?
Absolutely. So I'd like to say it. First of all, we have to decide on a few things. Number one, what's your budget? Number two, what resources do you currently have available? So, do you already have an office where you can shoot? Do you already have access to a studio? Do you already have something set up at home? Right? These are things to consider before you even start the podcast and everything like that. And also, before all of that, vision. What is the vision for the podcast? We need to get the foundation correct, because if you don't build the right foundation, or if you don't build foundation, then whatever you build on top of like that no foundation isn't going to last for very long. It won't take much to blow that all down. It's like building a house on rock rather than on sand, right? It's just not going to work if it's on sand. So you have to make sure your foundations and the vision is right from the very beginning and from the get-go. So you have to understand, first of all, why am I doing this podcast? Like, what is the reason for me doing this podcast? What is the reason for us doing this podcast? Are we just doing it because everybody else in the market is doing it? Are we doing it because I like Joe Rogan? Are we doing it because I like Steve Bartlett? Like, why are we doing this podcast? Right? You have to understand why we're doing it in the first place. Are we doing it to get in front of our ICP? Are we doing it to be able to actually speak to people in our industry and to network? Because that's another good reason to start a podcast. Are we doing this to give ourselves content? Is it literally just a content machine? We have to figure out, why are we doing what it is that we're doing with the podcast? What is the reason for starting it in the first place? Because with a clear enough why, you can survive anyhow, or you can get over and you can work out anyhow. So you have to make sure you have that why set in the first place, so that when you get 6 months down the line, you're not wondering, why are we even doing this? Because you understand you did it. You started off because of a certain reason. Are you going to continue because of a certain reason? And that's why a lot of people fall off as well, I believe. That's why a lot of people stop their podcast, because they don't remember why they did it in the first place, or why they did it in the first place wasn't strong enough. But that's step one. And after that, you have to think about equipment, of course. So personally, I like to either go to a studio where they already have all of the equipment, or I just do this at home where I am right now, because I used to be into videography and photography and such. So it's not that difficult for me to set up a little bit of lighting, up a camera, up a tripod and such. But I would recommend, if you want to do it in person, to go to a studio where they already have the equipment. If you're going to do it online, I would recommend Riverside. I was telling Dan earlier, I am not a fan. In fact, I'm an enemy of Zoom when it comes to podcasts. Yes, indeed. I am. That is my arch nemesis, right? I do not like Zoom because it will not record. It will not record in the right way when it comes to podcasting, right? It will. I'm pretty sure you've been there on a Zoom call where it would just start to go all fuzzy and you can't make out what the other person's saying, and there might be technical difficulties. But similar to StreamYard, which we're on right now, when you're on Riverside, it will actually record locally, so that when you actually put the podcast out there, and this is what I tell all my clients as well, so that we have the least amount of problems. When you put the podcast out there, it is so much smoother. And when they give us the podcast to edit, it is so much smoother to edit than having to edit something from Zoom, because that is no fun for anyone involved.
Do you think you need to start at a studio level though, or like is there a even easier barrier to entry?
Oh, definitely, definitely. You can start with your laptop and a mic, even your headphones. You can start with those. Ultimately, the most important thing is the content. And a lot of people say podcast, yes, you need audio. Yes, you do need good audio. Hence why I have this Shure MV7, which I would definitely recommend. But the main thing is the content. That is, everything else is just packaging. What is in the gift? You have to think about, you got the wrapping, right, of the gift, and you've got what is inside, which is the actual gift. The gift is the content. Make sure that you have the content in the first place. That is why I say the MVP. The MVP doesn't have to be perfect, right? It can be from a laptop, it can be from a webcam, for example, and it can be from like your just your headphones as a mic. And then over time you upgrade your equipment as you see, okay, let me upgrade the mic, let me upgrade the camera, let me upgrade the space. So for example, this didn't used to look like this. It used to, like, there used to be one little light, and there used to be my old camera. So this is a Canon 80D with like a Sigma 30 to 50 millimeter lens or something like that. I used to be into videography. That's why I can say all that stuff. And I also have a 700D, which I used to use. Actually, I used to use my camera, like my laptop camera. But then over time, you can get access to more equipment as you buy more equipment and just level up. But you can start with a webcam and your headphones. That is what I'd recommend. A lot of people wouldn't, but I think content is the most important thing. Content is king.
Yeah, like it doesn't, if the audio's a bit naff, if the video is a bit naff, but the message is crystal clear and resonates,
Mm,
that's probably way more important, right? Than having amazing audio and amazing video, but with a poor message, with a poor and not differentiated point of view.
absolutely. Absolutely. And even off the back of differentiation as well, make yourself stand out. from the beginning. What are you going to do to stand out? I remember there was this podcast that I think it was a soon to be client that I was speaking with actually, and they had a their podcast episodes were titled so differently, like so differently, like super. No, this wasn't actually. This was somebody else I was speaking to on LinkedIn. Their podcast episodes were titled so differently. It was stuff like Dan, when I find it, I'll send you a picture. But it was hilarious. The titles that it was like everyone in the niche of like B2B marketing would understand these titles because it mixes with pop culture. And I thought that is so smart because people are going to find that funny, and they're going to, well, the people who find that funny and the people that like that are going to be attracted to those podcast episodes, and they're going to become part of the community because they feel like they're heard. They feel like they can relate to the things that they're talking about, and the whole podcast matched that vibe of the titles too. So doing something that differentiates your podcast. For example, there was a podcast I used to listen to where the guy used to eat Doritos. They called him Dorito Dave for years, like for years, right? But then now his podcast is I can't remember where it is on the American charts, but it's definitely up there. And he's changed it from him just giving advice, like life advice, to it being called the Social Proof Podcast. So you can have a look at that at a later date. And then now he does all of his podcasts with a live studio audience of like 50 to 100 people. And then he had a whole podcast conference out in the US too. I think it was in Atlanta. And he's done that from starting to eat Doritos
Yeah,
on a podcast
that's
episode.
mad.
It's so what differentiates yourself? Are you going to have it? Is it going to be the I don't know, the marquee marketing podcast? So you sit underneath a marquee and you talk about marketing. Or what is it going to be? How are you going to differentiate yourself? Are you going to do something at the start of each episode, at the end of each episode that people can listen to? That is one thing to keep in mind, because I see a lot of people struggle, and people ask me as well, why start a podcast? Isn't podcasting saturated? And I say, no, it's not. Oh, well, yes, it is. But the only reason it's saturated is because a lot of people, or it is saturated in a way that a lot of people are doing the same thing. If you do something different, that saturation, it won't even bother you. It won't even be anything to you because you are so different that the saturation, it won't affect you. It won't affect you. And even to be saturated, it means to be full. That's what the actual definition of the word means. So can I just debunk that, please, Dan?
Go for it.
Thank you very much. So let me debunk that myth, right? To be saturated means to be full. So when someone says that the podcast market is too saturated, it means that there's no space left. And that couldn't be further from the truth. And you thinking that there's too much, that there's no space left in the podcast industry is not doing you any favors. Reason being is, let's say, for example, Stephen Bartlett, Diary of a CEO, if he thought that, then we wouldn't have Diary of a CEO. Joe Rogan, we wouldn't have his podcast. We wouldn't have the High Performance podcast. We wouldn't have what was Chris Walker's podcast. We wouldn't have his podcast, for example. And these people are all adding value to the industry. Mel Robbins, we wouldn't have her podcast. These people are all adding value to their industries with their podcasts. And if they had thought that the podcast industry was saturated, they never would have started in the first place. And that's like saying that book writing is saturated. Do you know how many books there are? But everybody is writing books, or authors are writing books because they understand that they have a particular message that they want to get out there. And that's what differentiates them, because it's the same thing. It's still a book. It's still got pages. It's still got a message in it. But then the only thing is, it's a different person who's writing it, right? And books can be similar, but the best books are the ones that are different. And it's the same thing with podcasts too. The same thing with podcasts. I can go more into that, but yeah, I just had to get that off my chest quick, Dan.
I thought, no, that's a great point to deviate on, right? Because like everything technically can be saturated, but it's how you have a unique output and outlook on that and differentiate yourselves, which mean that all of a sudden you don't become part of that saturation anyway.
That's it.
Yeah, it's a great point. Okay, back to, getting started, equipment, that kind of thing. Where do you stand on starting podcasts, like virtually like this or in person, whether it be live on LinkedIn like this, live on Zoom, like all those different formats you can have? Do you recommend a preference on those, a combination of those? And I actually listened to your episode on this, so I kind of know the answer you're going to give, but it's useful for everyone here, I think.
Nice. I mean, well, first of all, thanks for listening. I appreciate you. Everyone, give a round of applause to Dan. Yes, we love Dan. I would say a combination of the three, and testing a combination of the three, because you might realize that your audience likes the in-person, or you might realize that you like the in-person. You might realize that you like the virtual. You might realize that you really love LinkedIn Lives, for example. There's just something about a LinkedIn Live that just gets you going. So you have to figure out what works for you, and the way that you do that is to test. right? So for me, I like the in person because I'm a very personable type of person, and I also like virtual because there are certain people that I'm not trying to fly to South Africa just for a podcast. I mean, eventually, definitely, let's do it. Why not? Maybe me and Dan can go together. But I think for now, let's do it virtual, and then over time we'll start to fly out to do these podcasts and such. But virtual works when it needs to. And then I always prefer in person. Okay, there you go. There's the answer, Dan. I prefer in person and virtual when needs be. And I'm looking to test LinkedIn. That is probably the best succinct answer I can give.
Yeah, cool. Love it. And in terms of the approach you should take when inviting guests on and doing solo episodes and
Mhm.
hosting it with people at your company, if you are getting started, how should you think about that? Should you try and get as many guests on as possible? Should you do guest only? Should you do solo podcast only? What's the right balance or approach to take there?
I like to say to have a balance of internal podcasts and external podcasts. Reason being is that, let's say, for example, I think I might have spoke to you about this before recently when we met up, but let's say, for example, you're trying to get to know someone. Let's say, for example, I'm trying to get to know Dan, right? But then there's always somebody else there. So there's always, let's say, for example, Sarah joins us, or George joins us, or Mike joins us, right? Every time that we meet up, there's always somebody else there. Now, I'm never going to be able to get to know you properly, Dan, because there's always somebody else there. And it's the same thing as always getting guests onto your podcast. The audience never gets a chance to know you and to understand you and to build a connection with you. And ultimately, that is why that is why I podcast. That is why my clients podcast, to build a connection with their audience. And I'm sure that's similar to why you podcast as well, to build a connection with your audience. But I don't believe you can build an effective connection to somebody that you never speak to. Wow, that was good. Yeah, well done me. But I don't think that you can build a connection with somebody that you never speak to, right? So I really do believe that you should be speaking to your audience through solo podcasts, so the internal podcasts, and also speaking to guests feed your audience. So like guests and your audience at the same time with those guest podcasts, because those guest podcasts help in multiple ways. And I'm not trashing guest podcasts, they're amazing. They help in multiple ways. They get you out there, they expose you to a new audience. You get to bring someone on who you might think is cool, who you want to network with, whose audience you might want to get in front of as well, who you may even want to potentially turn into a client down the line as well. And both of them have their merits. So that's why I'd say to do a mixture of both, but don't forget those internal podcasts. They help so much.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody else about this a while ago as well. And I suppose if you're using the podcast for your own business benefit to drive your own business growth and
Mm-hmm.
things like that, then inviting guests on is not going to do that for you, because the
Mm-hmm.
guest at that point in time is the subject matter expert. You know, you're positioning the guest as the person with all of the expertise, with all of the answers to solve that particular problem that you're
Yeah.
discussing in that episode. Whereas if you are positioned as that subject matter expert, then your audience will understand you can solve that problem and, you know, build affinity with you and trust and create demand potentially in the future for that solution. Yeah, I can't remember where I heard that, but it was a really interesting. It might have been on a podcast, probably. You know,
Probably.
I literally just listen to podcasts all day, every day. Anyway, so yeah, I suppose just rounding up the kind of point of getting started,
Mm-hmm.
how many episodes should somebody be looking to create upfront or batch record and, you know, release at one point in time?
Just for a little bit more clarity. So, do you mean before they launch, or what do you mean by that?
Both. So, like,
Okay.
before they launch, should they be preparing a big, large batch of
Mm-hmm.
episodes? When they launch, how many episodes are best to launch, you know, to publish, like, in what cadence?
I'd say about 4 episodes to record before launch. And the reason I don't say like 8 or 12 or even more than that is because, first of all, you don't even know what works. So you're creating content without even knowing what your audience likes yet. Or maybe you might know what your audience likes because you've done content before or you've worked in this industry before. However, this is something new that you're starting. So I wouldn't recommend to do loads and loads of content. So like over 4 podcasts. I think 4 is a nice number, because if you're down the MVP method, down the MVP route, that's about 2 months worth of content. And if you're going down the normal podcast route, which is 1 podcast per month, sorry, no, that would not be optimal at all. If you were doing 1 podcast per week, there we go, then that would at least give you a month of runway for you to be able to get other stuff, recorded and such. So I would say about 4 episodes. That's what I would say personally, because it gives you some time to actually iterate and for you to understand, okay, so the audience likes this. Okay, let me record this differently. And for example, you might even realize that you want to add in some sort of ads, for example, over time. And if you want to add in ads, then it makes sense for you to record later on down the line to add in those ads. So when the episodes are ready to come out, they would have the ads in them, and it would be applied earlier on in the podcast sequence, right? So it would be applied in episode 5 rather than in episode 17. Okay, that these you can make the changes a lot quicker. There you go. There's a much better feedback loop, right? Because you're going to be able to hear from the audience, hear from the team, hear from other people that listen to the podcast, and understand what is working and what isn't a lot faster than if you were to record all the content up front.
Yeah, it's a good shout about the iteration piece. I like this comment from Justin Campbell. Well, his first one was, I don't agree with that. And we're running like 30 seconds behind on StreamYard, so I didn't know the exact point that he didn't agree with, but I think it was
Okay.
mine. I think it was mine about, positioning yourself as the expert on a solo podcast
Hmm.
or an internal podcast with people from your company versus getting guests on. And he made a fair point, which I would love to get your take on as well, because I'm not a podcast
Absolutely.
expert here, right? I'm just kind of sharing my experience and things I've heard. But he made a valid point here, which I think we should get your take on, Jonathan.
Let's do it.
I think having a great guest shows you can bring a new opinion. You're still the host, which is a powerful position. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts on that are, is number one, yeah, he's right. Like, it's still a powerful position to be, the host and everything like that. But I think it depends on how you go about it. It depends on how you go about the episode. So if you're conducting that episode as if it's like an interview, for example, so you're just asking the person, oh, okay, what did you think about that? Okay, interesting. What's your thoughts on this? All right, okay. And then what do you think about this? Okay, cool. That, I wouldn't say that that's like a high authority play, but something which is a lot better and maybe even puts you in a better light is you adding your value too on the episode. So there is that level of, okay, yes, I am associated with this person, so I brought them on as a guest, I'm associated with this person. But even if you bring someone onto the podcast who is doing what they're doing and even doing something similar to you in a similar space and is a quote unquote authority, it will make them look like even more of an authority because you invited them on. But the way to combat that, or the way to, I guess, give a fix for that, is to add your value on the episode. So not only is that guest adding value, but you're also adding value too. So when you're both adding value, it's just like just overall added value, right? You both look like authorities because you both know what you're talking about. Okay. But if you just sit there like an interviewer and just asking them questions and not giving any of your own value, then of course it will look like the other person is the authority there because you're literally just asking them questions. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and probably something that I missed when I think this was referring to my point. And it's about, if you are the host, join in the
Hmm.
conversation. Don't
Yeah.
just let it be a one-way conversation where you're just sitting back and basically being a news reporter asking questions. Actually have back and forth dialogue, which gives you an opportunity to share your expertise as well. And I think being a host can then, for sure, have its benefits. But I
Yeah.
still think I'm still not overly keen on just guest only podcasts. And I don't know what your thoughts are on that. I still like having separate episodes that are just internal or solo podcasts only, that really just position you and only you as the subject matter expert there. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I love that too. That's exactly what I do. And that's exactly what I tell my clients to do. Because a lot of my clients, they don't I have this ongoing joke with a lot of my clients of like, they didn't like podcasts. Like they didn't, sorry, they did like podcasts. Of course they did. That's why they work with me. But they didn't like solo podcasting before. And I introduced the idea to them when we started working together. And they were like, I'll do it if I have to. But now they're asking me, okay, what do you think I should do for my next solo podcast? Should I do this for my solo podcast or this for my solo podcast? Because now they understand the benefit of it and now they're used to it. I think the problem is a lot of people are scared of just sitting down and talking to the camera for half an hour to an hour. We spoke about this earlier as well, Dan. A lot of people are scared of that, and that's completely understandable because it's not a normal thing to do. Like not every one of us is a YouTuber, so it's not like second nature to us, right? But then you have to, if you want to really build that connection with your audience, a solo podcast or an internal podcast is definitely the way forwards, in my opinion. And blending that with the guest episodes, because as I said, they both have their merits. So why not, instead of picking one or the other, have both? That's what I believe.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for that response, and thanks for the comment there, Justin.
Yeah, thank you for the comment.
Appreciate your thoughts. Cool. Okay, I feel like we've kind of covered like the getting started piece now. People kind of know what equipment to have, know what software's there, know when and how to create episodes. Now let's get into the growth strategies. How you actually take your podcast to the next level, reach new people, let it generate revenue and results for your business. And I'm going to intentionally leave this as a bit of an open-ended question for you, because I don't want to take you down any particular route. But what are some of the best growth strategies, or ways that you can grow a podcast?
Well, first and foremost, one thing that people forget a lot is an email list. Utilizing your email list and utilizing it straight off the bat. So with the launch, and not just with the launch, with episode 1, with episode 2, with episode 3, with episode 4, using that email list, whether that's creating a separate sort of like segmented email list for the podcast specifically, whether that's adding it into your newsletter, whether that's sending out a blast when you release the podcast episode, or a monthly blast, kind of going over what you've spoken about in a podcast episode. That is a big one that a lot of people forget. An email list, because that is your own, that is your own, I can't remember what it was called. I think is it own contacts or something like that?
Owned media, maybe.
Owned media, something like that, right?
Yeah.
So these are you can control that. People, if you send an email, it is going to come to their phone or their device into their inbox, right? But if you post something on social media, not everybody's going to see that, because in my opinion, the algorithm is becoming a lot more pay to play. And if you look at social media platforms in general, over time, so this is how I see the social media platforms progressing, right? So for example, Facebook, if you wanted to be really famous on Facebook at the start, it was organic. Loads of people going viral on Facebook at the start, loads and loads of people. Same thing as Instagram, loads of people going viral organically. But over time, it's become more pay to play, and I believe we're going to probably see the same thing with TikTok over time as well. And that's me getting my Gary V on to kind of tell in the future. But if you want to, sorry, anyway, let me get back to the point. If you want to grow on these platforms, and if you want to grow your podcast, social media is a big way forward, right? So social media platforms like LinkedIn, for example, is doing very, very well video content wise. I believe that it's actually optimizing for video, and is actually pushing out video a lot more. I'm not sure, have you seen that the feed, like the TikTok kind of scrolling feed on LinkedIn?
Yeah, well, I think I posted about this on LinkedIn when they first announced it, because in time it is going to come, right? It's going to replace the
Absolutely.
home icon on mobile, which no, the post icon, sorry. The post, like being able to post, will then go into the feed like anything else. And that post section that's there now will become video and be a feed. But yeah, basically, like it's only on mobile, I think, isn't it? When you like watch a video, it actually prompts you to swipe, which I found quite interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's coming. It's coming.
Absolutely. And I can speak about growing on TikTok. We've got millions and millions of views on TikTok. I can speak about growing on Instagram. We've got hundreds of thousands of views on Instagram. But because this is a B2B thing, and of course you could do B2B on those platforms, but mostly we're talking about LinkedIn, right? And that's the platform that I operate on the most. And because of what you just said, I think public service announcement, get good at video now. Prioritize video now. Start to practice and start to try and start to test things out with video now. Because if what Dan's saying is true, and I have no reason to doubt Dan, then that home button, or that post button, is going to be replaced by the feed button, right? And you're going to be able to scroll. One of the first things you're doing on Instagram, sorry, not Instagram, LinkedIn, is scrolling. Make sure that you are getting good with video content right now. Start putting stuff out there. Because when that becomes the case, and when it becomes the case where LinkedIn is video first, you don't want to be the one that's just trying to catch up. So make sure
Yeah,
that you're starting from now.
yeah, love it. Anything else? I've got one in mind, but I'm going to save it.
Absolutely. Also, in terms of growing, and because you said growing the actual podcast, and you said also generating revenue from it. So growing the podcast, always being in front of people. That's the main thing to keep in mind. How do I always appear in front of people? Consistently posting on a consistent basis, right? So every single day, if you can, to be posting. And one thing that people miss out as well on LinkedIn is posting on the weekends. People think no one's going to be on LinkedIn on the weekends. They are on LinkedIn on the weekends. I mean, I'm not sure about you, but I even check LinkedIn on the weekends. It's like a habit. I don't know why. I kind of go through my cycle
No,
of
I get
social
you.
media profiles. There you go. I just kind of check on LinkedIn as well for whatever reason, but people are on there on the weekend. Don't miss out on that. And also, in terms of generating revenue from the back of LinkedIn, you have so many different options. Sorry, off the back of a podcast, you have so many different options. You have the option of paid speaking engagements, that those come inbound over time as well. I'm not sure if you've had any yet, Dan, but they will come over time. That's because I can see what you're doing with this
Yeah.
podcast.
Well, funnily enough, right, we had a sponsorship opportunity come through a few weeks
There you
ago.
go.
Not for this
There you go.
podcast, but we've got another podcast called Websites Decoded, which our co-founder Phil hosts, which is basically like really short tactical episodes. And I was literally mind blown, right? When
Yeah.
the sponsorship opportunity wasn't right for us, given our relationships elsewhere. But
Mhm.
I was just like, what? Like, are people really like paying that for sponsorships? Yeah, it's
Absolutely. And if they were offering you that off the bat as well, people are likely paying more. So that's another thing. So sponsorships, that's another thing too. So there's paid speaking engagements, there's sponsorships, also from people who are aligned. That's a very key one, making sure that people who are aligned, you are working with those people who are aligned with your business, who are aligned with the values that you guys hold. Also, you have a premium content as well, so you can actually like gate premium content. For me, that this works when it's on a much bigger scale as well, so when we're talking about bigger podcasts with bigger audiences. Also making sure that you have something to sell and adding some call to actions in there. So even adding some sort of an ad into your podcast, it doesn't mean like, oh, book a call with me now. No, it means like, if you want to find out more information about what we do, head down to the description below, right? There's those kind of things that you can do too, and there's so many different ways to generate income from the podcast. But another thing to bear in mind, just like with organic, is just consistently be in front of people. Like I can't even count on my hands how many times people have come to me as a prospect looking to turn into a client just because they keep seeing me on a regular basis on LinkedIn. And LinkedIn is a platform that I focus on. And that is how we generate demand from the podcast, not demand, and how we generate, I guess,
Mm.
revenue from the podcast too. And we capture that demand is through LinkedIn, and it's through putting the content out there on a regular basis and making ourselves available and in front of people's faces. Did not mean for that to rhyme, but it did. So here we go.
No, it's always a positive when it rhymes, right? In terms of,
Absolutely.
sorry, just one point on those clips,
Mhm.
like just some real tactical advice. Do you have any
Mm.
advice on the length of those and the format of those in particular?
Absolutely. So because of the way that LinkedIn is going, now I'm testing out the 16. Is it 16 by 9 or 9 by 16? You know, the TikTok kind of
Yeah,
format
9 by
videos,
16.
9 by 16. I'm testing out those videos on LinkedIn to see how they perform. Looks like it's gonna be performing similar to my videos already, how they were already going, and it's gonna take up the whole of the screen because most people are using their LinkedIn on their phones as well. Um, and sorry, what was the question again? I just want to make sure that I answer it properly.
Any tips around format, which I think you've just covered there,
Yeah.
and length of video as well?
My main tip is to test. My main tip is to test. Different lengths work for different people. So if you're a really good long form person, go long form. If you're a really good short form person, you can give like really impactful, punchy bits of information. Try short form and try both, right? And for me, I tried different lengths, and I've seen that the longer clips that I do, they get less engagements, but I get more comments from them and I get more feedback from them. And more people are asking me, sending me DMs about them. But then the shorter ones, they may reach more people, but I won't get as much. It will go wider, but it won't go as deep. Right.
Mm,
So that's what I've seen with my content, but that's only because I've tested it. So I don't like to give like say, oh, everyone should do short or everyone should do long. I think everyone should test and see what works better for you. And a lot of people don't want to, and I understand, but that is how you win. You win by testing and optimizing.
yeah. What about podcast ads as a growth strategy? And I haven't looked into this and don't know much about it, to be honest, but I
Mhm.
know I listen to a lot of podcasts, and then all of a sudden I'm listening to one podcast about Formula One, and then I'm getting ads for like Salesforce
Yeah.
and marketing things. And it's like, "Well, that's strange, right? Surely this podcast isn't advertising that to everyone. That must be targeted to me. I get the targeting because I'm a marketer, but have you seen success with running podcast ads for any of your clients? Like, yeah, what are your general thoughts on those?
Personally, as you know, I'm a very transparent person. I don't do those kind of ads. That sounds like I'm not even sure. Like, did you say you're getting marketing advertisements on a Formula
Right.
One podcast?
So I listen to, yeah, it's a bit sad, isn't it? I know, but
No,
I listen
I wouldn't
to
say it's sad.
I listened to a podcast called the P1 Podcast, right? Two
Okay,
great guys, Matt and Tommy, who, yeah, I mean, discuss Formula One, like the races, and things like that. Like, I'm a big sports fan in general, and
nice.
motorsport as well. And I find it impossible to believe that they're really advertising like marketing software and tools to everybody
Mm,
on a Formula One podcast. That must be targeted in some way. Maybe I'm wrong, and they are,
mm,
because one of them was Salesforce, right? And they probably do target everyone. But
right.
I don't know. Yeah, I just
For
found
my,
it interesting.
for myself, I don't know too much about that in terms of targeting from podcast ads and such. But then what I do know about is actually paying for podcast ad slots on somebody else's podcast. See, that
Mm,
makes more sense to me because you know that it directly aligns with whatever it is that you're trying to do and what you're. So, for example, let's say, for example, I wanted to get an ad slot on your podcast and I was going to pay you X. I would say, have a listen to the Thought Leaders Handbook, which is my podcast. Find us on www.reidentify.co/podcast, right? That is actually how you find me. And then people, I just did ad, and then people will be able to
I'm
find
going to
me.
delete that from the recording.
Well,
I'm gonna
okay,
bleep
right,
that
there
out.
you go. But literally, people will be able to hear that bit there, and you can sell that. You can sell that little time slot. You can sell that slot of go listen to my podcast at whatever website .co or .com, and you can sell that, right? That's what I have. That's what I have experience with. It's a lot more basic than the whole targeting thing, but then you can literally just choose. I want to be on this podcast. How much is it for a podcast slot? That is what I have experience with, and it does help quite a lot because if you think about it, you are speaking to people who are already listening to a podcast and you're just telling them to come and listen to this other podcast, which is going to add value to their lives as well. And the regular person in, I think it is in the USA, listens to about 8 podcasts per week. So why can't you be another one of the podcasts that they listen to? I think people
That,
have the
they're
scarcity
rookie
mindset a
numbers.
lot of the time, unfortunately. But with the abundance mindset, you understand that people can listen to your podcast and somebody else's podcast, even if it's in the same industry. They're just getting two different perspectives. And sorry, you were saying something? I don't think I heard it.
Yeah, no, sorry, I was just referring to the fact 8 podcasts a week. They are
Yeah.
absolute rookie numbers. They need to be up in those because I'm on about 20.
Well, there you go. And remember, it's an average as well. So for me, I actually,
That's
funnily
true.
enough, I don't listen to that many podcasts in a week because I used to listen to closer to your numbers, honestly. But then now I listen to about 3 podcasts per week. If, well, aside from my clients and my podcast, of course, I listen to about 3 podcasts per week.
That's
Reason
so.
being is that, go on.
No, just on that, like you say, you listen to your podcast. Do you listen back to your podcast? Because sometimes, like people at Blend will ask me, like, "Oh, do you listen back to Demand Decoded?" And I'll say, like, "Yeah." Like, I
Absolutely.
listen back to every episode once. Like, I listen back once.
Yeah. Well,
Like, is that normal?
I think personally, I don't know if it's normal, but one thing I do know, Dan, is any any athlete, any athlete who is good at what they're doing, they're looking back at their gameplay because they understand number one, the way for me to get better is to understand and analyze what I've done before. And number two, I like watching myself play, right? Like I'm a good player. I want to watch myself play and I enjoy watching myself play. And just like how I assume you probably enjoy listening back to the episodes because you have fun doing this. And the same thing with me and my episodes. Sometimes I listen back to an episode to like to review it or see what my editors have done and everything like that. And I'll just end up just sitting back, just watching the episode and just smiling whilst I watch it because I just like to watch it, right? But I have to also analyze what I've done just so that I can continue to improve over time. So that's another reason why I watch my podcast episodes.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you made what I was trying, kind of making a joke about. Actually, a really, really great and interesting point. Like, if you want to get better at talking, asking questions, answering, listening, one of the best ways to do that is to listen back to the episodes for sure.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I was gonna say something else, but I can't remember what it was. It's about what we were speaking about before. But anywho, it will come back to me.
Yeah, one of the growth thing
Mhm.
that I've heard before is around podcast SEO, and making sure that your podcast is as visible as possible within podcast, what are they even, podcast players like
What
Spotify.
directories? Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Like, yeah, tips, thoughts.
So with Spotify and such, to be honest, when it comes to SEO, I look more so onto YouTube because that is where I get the most searchabilities and my clients get the most searchabilities for podcasts is YouTube. So understanding that, okay, YouTube is actually a search platform rather than just somewhere you just go to watch videos, right? It's, I think, the second biggest search platform in the world or something like that, online. And with platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts and such, just making sure that you title your episodes in the correct way. Um, that is probably one of the biggest things because you could do the metadata and everything like that. But what I've seen as being the biggest result, or the has got the best result, has been titling your episodes in the correct way. So titling it in a way of what would people actually type in. So are people going to type in how to launch a podcast, or are people going to type in podcasting basics 101? Right? What are people more
Mm,
likely to type in?
yeah.
So having that in mind when you're titling your podcast is a really big key on YouTube and on the normal podcast directories too.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, like this, for example, I probably shouldn't call it the B2B podcast formula on YouTube.
I mean, but wait, is in the title of the podcast?
Well, I think the title for the podcast is different, right? But like for YouTube, maybe that's
Mm.
not right because it's not answering the question, like you said.
I think another thing with YouTube as well, you can test. Yeah, Dan, I think I probably said test like 20 times today, but you can really test. And even you could test thumbnails. I'm not sure if you've seen that, but you can actually split test thumbnails now on YouTube, and it will actually like run a test for you and show you the analytics of what actually got clicked on more and what got clicked on less and everything like that. But you can test even with titles too. But what I've seen work on YouTube the most is the how-tos, the uh for it, what is, like, I've seen those kind of starts of titles do the best because people are typing in questions in the search bar.
Any other, before we move on, any other growth strategies that you want to mention, or do you think that's about it?
I would say, of course, these other platforms as well. So if doubling down on LinkedIn is great, but then also the next generation and where things are going, we are talking about TikTok, we are talking about Instagram, because people do spend, like, the same people who are on LinkedIn, they also have TikTok accounts and Instagram accounts and everything like that. So making sure that you are on these platforms too, or at least starting to get onto these platforms and testing them if you have the resources. If you don't have the resources and your resources are better spent on one platform, let that platform be LinkedIn. If you do have the resources to test different platforms, test other platforms like TikTok and LinkedIn, and Instagram and such, because that will, lead to even more growth because people are on these platforms and they're listening.
Yeah, cool, amazing. Now, one take that I want to get from you, which is the reverse, really. We've spoken about the positives, the changes that you can make to get a positive growth impact. But what are some of the biggest mistakes that you see when people are starting out or trying to grow a podcast, that you just, need to straight up avoid?
Well, first of all, their expectations are too high. They think that their podcast is going to be rivaling Steve Bartlett's in on day one and in week one. It doesn't work like that, and it takes time. And I remember with my podcast, the first podcast I done, which is called Purpose Led, we've done it for about 3 years. It wasn't until like just after year one when we started to gain a little bit of traction, when people started to listen to us and everything like that. It took a little while for it to get going, but then fast forward a couple of years and we were doing very well, and we touched
Mm,
top 5% most shared podcast in the personal development space, which is amazing. That was crazy to get that from Spotify. But we got that by being persistent and continuing to push in that industry and in that category. And if we were to have thought that things were going to be skyrocketing from the very beginning, then number one, we would have been wrong. And number two, it would have probably caused us to give up a lot earlier as well. Another thing is to not always see negative comments as hate. Sometimes negative comments are just feedback, but just with a just not given in the best way possible, right? So look at negative comments, and it's not always hate. Sometimes people see it as like, oh, this person's hating, or this person doesn't like me, or this random user, unknown user 123, really hates what we're doing, and I'm terrible, and I'm the worst person. No, right? No. So understand that, number one, even though it might seem negative, there might be some truth to it. So have a look into actually take it for what it is. What are they actually saying? Are they saying that your audio is trash? If your audio isn't that good, then they might be right. They just didn't say it in the nicest way, right? Are they saying that I didn't like this topic? I mean, that doesn't really add value, but it maybe means that you can try different topics as well. And also to take in the good things that people are saying too and double down on that. If people are saying that they like X, they like Y, double down on that, right? Another thing is speaking with the audience as well, making sure that you communicate with your audience, because how are you going to know what your audience wants if you don't speak to them? So engage with them, ask them questions on the podcast, ask them questions on social media. Another thing also, I know I'm throwing them out there just like quick
No,
fire, but
run.
another thing also is community, building a community. If you build a community around what it is that you do, you will have so much power behind you, because these are people that really that like they're on the journey with you. They're people who understand the mission. They're people who like the content. They're people that like you, right? Another thing to think about and to remember is that a podcast isn't just, it's not just to grow pipeline and everything like that. It's not just to grow the personal brand. It's to grow an audience, and it's to grow a community, and it's to grow a group of people who believe a certain thing. And it doesn't have to stop at that one podcast. You can have another podcast down the line. You can start something else. And because people love you from the I say love, but because people like you from the podcast, they likely will follow you to that next thing that you do as well. Because it's not the podcast that they like, it's the people on the podcast, right? It's what the podcast represents. It's the company. That's what they like. And well, I say the company, but people like people. And by definition, company is a group of people. So people like the people, right? People who are listening to the podcast like the people who are on the podcast. So they're willing to follow them to wherever it is that they go, or to wherever it is that the podcast hosts and the people who run the podcast direct them to, which is why call to actions are so effective. That's another thing as well. I'm still going. That's another thing as well. Having call to actions and effective call to actions. What do you want people to do when they visit your podcast episode? That is why my podcast is successful, even though it's a pretty small podcast, because I give people actionable call to actions. And I say, right, go and do this if you're interested in that. Check the link in the bio if you're interested in this. Have this free resource if you're interested in that. I give people clear actions and clear things to do. A lot of people think, oh, it's not working. You haven't asked for anything. You haven't asked the audience anything. You just put content out there and you're thinking something magical is going to happen. But you have to put something, you have to ask them, okay, you have to give them an option to give value back to you. You have to say, okay, cool, check out the website for more information. For example, take this free resource. For example, join this community. For example, come to our next event. And that's another thing as well. Hey, I've got so many. That's another thing as well. Live events. If you can do live events, please do. So Dan, if you can do live events with Demand Decoded, please do, because I think it makes it a lot more real. Like, even if you're quote unquote smaller, or not where you want to be, it makes it a lot more real. And
Mhm.
you can you get to see people, you get to look them in the eye, and they get to say, look, I like what it is that you're doing, thank you. Right, that they get to see that value up front, they get to see the value in person, and you get to see your audience in person as well, which is it's an amazing feeling. It's really an amazing feeling, and you can do that when you're starting out as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I want to throw one in there,
Hmm.
which is a bit left field because it's not necessarily tactical, but one of the biggest podcast mistakes, I think, is not getting started.
Mm,
When I look back, and I was forced to look back the other day at episode 1 of Demand Decoded because somebody DM'd and
yeah.
strangely asked for a downloadable recording of it because they wanted to use
Wow.
some of the insights at a meeting actually, which was quite interesting. And it was
Hmm.
horrific, right? Like it was the worst thing I've ever watched in my entire life.
Wow.
I'm quite happy, still not perfect by any means, but I've progressed since there, at least. But we got started. I got started, and yeah, I think that is one of the biggest mistakes, just not getting started in the first place.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think I kind of definitely went on a tangent there, because I was just giving tips rather than saying mistakes when you're getting started. But I'd say another one of the biggest mistakes also is thinking that you need all the fancy equipment. And that's another thing that stops people from starting in the first place, is thinking that they need the fancy equipment. You can get started with just a minimum viable podcast. And if there's anything that people take from this, please, you can really start a minimum viable podcast, an MVP, which is about 2 podcasts per month. low effort. It doesn't, okay, not, I say low effort, but that does not mean no effort, right? Still put effort into the podcast, still deliver value, still plan it and everything like that. But it doesn't have to be really high quality production, right? You can get started from where you are, because ultimately we have the resources to get started, even if we don't know it, even if we don't know it.
Yeah, amazing. Just to round things off, I wanted to touch on the measurement part because we briefly touched on it earlier, but
Mhm.
this is one of the main questions that I see around B2B podcasting. It's the lack of attribution and the lack of
Right.
measurement. So how do you actually go about measuring business impact that a podcast has? That made
Let
no
me,
sense. You get the
no,
question.
I get the question, and I actually have it on my laptop as well, so I can even
Oh,
look
here
up
we
our
go.
podcast. So we have like a podcast manager, and
Ah,
then on the podcast manager, we right open up my Google Sheets. On the podcast manager, we will track all of the relevant metrics. Let me see if I can find it.
yeah, that would be like interesting to know what you guys are tracking for
Absolutely.
clients and things like that.
And also, I think I even spoke to you about this recently as well when we met up, and you asked a similar question in terms of metrics, and then we talked about lift, didn't we? Yeah, we spoke about lift, and I think I might have gone through this as well with you. Hold on a sec. Ah, it's this one. Right. Ah, there we go. Metrics tracker. Lovely. So, of course, as per usual, we'll be tracking the podcast listens. We'll be tracking followers, like the amount of followers that you have on not just on the social platforms, but also on the podcast platforms too. Um, Also reviews. What are people saying about the podcast? Because we like, yeah, we see 5 out of 5 stars or 4 out of 5 stars, but what are people actually saying in the reviews, in the feedback? Let's pay attention to that. Also, website traffic. So what does a lift look like, as we spoke about recently? Are you getting an increased amount of people visiting your website from the podcast, for example? And you can track your links, so you can use I think it's UTM links. You can also um use what was those links that we did, bitly links as well. You can do bitly links if you don't know how to do all the UTM links and such. Those help a lot to see, okay, what traffic is coming from the podcast and going to the website. And of course you can see lift as well, so
Mhm.
when you launch the podcast, from when you launched the podcast and when you didn't have the podcast, see what the difference is. um Also social impressions too of the actual clips, so the clips that you're
Mhm.
putting out there, okay, how many people are we reaching with these clips, with these social clips? Also sales cycle length, so is the sales cycle length decreasing, is it increasing, right? What is the podcast doing to impact that? Because also what you can do when you're, so we're talking B2B here, when you're trying to get a deal across the line, you can ping over podcast episodes. Pinging over podcast episodes helps a lot because it just exposes that prospect or that potential client or client that might come on board pretty soon to you even more. And it helps so much because it's just like they're talking to you. They're just hearing you over and over and over again, and it helps so much. So seeing what that impact has, or what the impact that has on sales cycle length as well, and even bringing potential clients onto the podcast too, what potential impact that has on sales cycle length, number of inbound leads, as I said earlier, and then also close rate. So is it easier to close clients? Is it easier to close clients when you've had the podcast, or is it harder to close clients, which is exactly what
Mhm.
we don't want? Meetings and demos booked, that's another thing that we always monitor as well, because we want to see, okay, what is the impact of what we are doing? Is it make are we getting more calls? Are we getting more demos booked? Are we getting more people that are interested in? So those are a few of the things that we track, and I hope that helps.
Yeah, and just a quick one because I know we're pretty much out of time. But on those things like
Mhm.
meetings booked, like close rate, are you well more like meetings booked and inbound requests? Are you just looking at lift there, or are you using any other type of attribution to say that they came from the podcast?
So you can still do the UTM links. So you can still do the UTM links and the Bitly links as well. But usually we look at lift. Usually we look at lift because when we work with clients, a lot of the time, like, okay, I'd say, okay, not it used to be a lot of the time, but I'd say now 50% of our clients are usually smaller. So that the podcast is one of the main marketing strategies that they're using. So it's usually going to come from the podcast or something related to the podcast. But with our bigger clients, it will have to be tracked. It will have to be like UTM or a bit.ly link or something like that to make sure that the links that we're including in the podcast are being tracked. However,
Mm,
people don't always when people listen to podcasts, it's not they might just type up your website. They might listen to your podcast and go onto your LinkedIn and click there. They might listen to your podcast, type in on YouTube and then click there, and then YouTube will get the attribution. But one thing that helps us a lot is that self-reported attribution. So that how did you hear about us form? So it's like, or how did you hear about us field? So making sure that you have podcasts as an option there, or even having it as like an open field. So it doesn't
yeah,
have to be. I think I even heard Chris Walker talk about this the other day. So it doesn't have to be like, you don't have to group it into podcast, LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok. You can have it as an open field, so people can actually type in wherever it is that they heard from you, because they might say LinkedIn clip, they might say YouTube clip, they might say from Dan's profile, they might say from the podcast, from Demand Decoded. So people can say different things, but ultimately it's come from the podcast. So that's been a big way that's helped us a lot, to actually say, okay, where has this traffic come from? Is the how did you hear about our self-attributed field?
yeah. Same thing for us. Self-reported attribution is, being a real insightful thing to put on, because it highlights those dark channels that have no direct attribution, like
Mm.
podcasting. Keep it open text. I think I actually did my first solo episode on Demand Decoded about self-reported attribution. So
How was
yeah,
that?
scary. It was strange doing a solo podcast, to be honest, because that actually might be the only one I've done since. But I basically almost scripted the whole thing, right? Because
Hmm.
I wrote the blog post about
Hmm.
self-reported attribution and then
Okay.
recorded a podcast episode to include in the blog post. So,
Hmm.
I mean, to be fair, I literally just had bullet points listed out that I wanted to cover. Because I don't know, I couldn't just do it off the cuff. I'm not one of those people that have the ability just to speak off the cuff. Some people can do it. I just couldn't.
I'll be honest with you, Dan. What I call, so sometimes I will be able to speak off the cuff. So when it comes to solo podcasts, I do them a lot. And sometimes I will be able to just go and then just flow. But it just depends on the topic. If there's something that I really want to talk about, then I'll keep going. As you've probably seen on this episode, I'll just I'll keep talking. But then a lot of the time I need some sort of structure. And I feel like there are certain topics that you can flow on, and there's certain topics that you can't flow on. Right. So I always give myself some sort of structure, some sort of bullet points. I call it semi-scripting. So I'll put down about 5 to 10 key points. It's called a semi-script because it's not a mini script where it's a couple of bullet points. It's not a full script where you've scripted out the whole thing. It's a semi-script somewhere in between. Get 5 to 10 key points of the podcast episode that you want to cover, and then put about maybe 3 to 5 key points underneath those points. So, if you ever get lost, you know where to come back to. And that helps me a lot for solo podcasting. That helps me a lot for podcasting with guests as well, because I always have something to talk to and I always have some sort of anchor point to come back to. And I don't feel like I'm reading something word for word. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, really great advice. And maybe I'll try another solo episode off the back of that.
Please do. Let me know how you find it as well. Let me know how you find it. And another tip for solo podcasting and solo episodes, just like, do you have an editing team?
We have one editor. Yeah, I do some of it
Perfect.
myself, but we also have a motion and video videographer actually at Blend who, yeah,
Okay.
helps us out. Set all this up basically. I don't
Perfect.
have the technical capability to do it all myself.
The reason I ask is because what we like to do is and what I like to do as well is I like to just talk. So it doesn't matter if I've made a mistake. It doesn't matter if I've kind of drifted off. I just talk and I just keep it recording, and I go through my points and everything like that. And if there's anything I need to add in, I would add it in towards the end, and I would ask the editor literally on the camera, say, "Oh, can we actually move this, Justin? Can we move this to the middle of the podcast where I was talking about X or where I was talking about Y?" Just to talk, because it gets the pressure off you of having to feel like, oh, this needs to be smooth, when it really doesn't. It really doesn't. There's somebody I'd recommend looking into. His name is Rob Dial. His podcast is called The Mindset Mentor. And that podcast, I'd even say that podcast changed my life. That podcast, I was listening to it a lot in lockdown or just before lockdown happened, the C-19 and everything like that.
Mhm.
And that was a solo podcast, and it's been a solo podcast for a very long time, but he does it very well. I say to look into him.
Okay, I've written it down. The Mindset Mentor. you know me, I'll have probably binge watched every single or binge listened every single episode by the next time we meet up and chat. So yeah, I'll let you
Amazing.
know how I get on. Cool.
Wonderful.
Right. Let's wrap it up there. I think, Jonathan, it's been so great having you. And I think, you know, our audience, but me as well, have taken away so much great advice around podcasting. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on. It's been great having you.
Thank you for having me, Dan.